When we talk about cyber warfare, the first mistake is to imagine it as simply an extension of traditional conflict into the digital world. Tanks become code, missiles become malware, and battlefields become networks. That analogy is comforting, but it is misleading because cyber warfare is not just a new domain of war. It is a fundamentally different environment where the rules of visibility, timing, and even sovereignty behave in ways that no earlier generation of strategists had to confront. In traditional warfare, conflict is tied to geography. You cross a border, you move troops, you occupy territory, and the world can see it happening. Even when war is asymmetric or irregular, there is still a physical dimension that anchors it in space. Cyber warfare breaks that anchor. It operates in a space where geography is irrelevant, where distance collapses into milliseconds, and where action can occur without any visible movement at all. This is why it is useful to think of cyber conflict as an invisible battlefield. But invisible does not mean abstract or secondary. In fact, it is increasingly central to how modern power is exercised. The systems that underpin daily life, electricity grids, financial networks, communication infrastructure, transportation systems, even healthcare databases are all deeply digitalized. And that means they are also potentially accessible, influenceable, and disruptible through cyber means. So what we are really talking about is not just military competition in cyberspace, but a contest over the stability of the systems that modern societies depend on to function. And that shifts the nature of vulnerability. In earlier eras, vulnerability was often geographic. You were vulnerable where your borders were exposed. Today, vulnerability is systemic. It is embedded in the digital architecture that connects everything together. And this creates a very different psychological landscape for conflict. Because when a threat is invisible, it is also harder to measure, harder to anticipate, and harder to emotionally process. A missile strike is immediate and tangible. A cyber intrusion may be silent, delayed, or only visible when its consequences appear later. That delay between action and impact introduces a new kind of uncertainty into strategic thinking. This is where cyber warfare becomes more than just a technical domain. It becomes a psychological instrument. The ability to potentially disrupt a system without immediate detection changes how states think about risk, trust, and resilience. It forces governments and institutions to constantly ask, are our systems currently secure, or are they already compromised in ways we do not yet understand? And that question, left unanswered, creates a background condition of permanent strategic anxiety. But there is another layer to this. Cyber warfare is not only about disruption, it is about access. Once an actor gains access to a system, even temporarily, that access can be used in multiple ways: to observe, to collect information, to map vulnerabilities, or to prepare for future action. In that sense, cyber operations are often less about immediate impact and more about positioning within an adversary system over time. This makes cyber conflict fundamentally cumulative. It is not always about dramatic, visible moments of destruction. More often, it is about persistent engagement at the infrastructure level, where small intrusions can build over time into significant strategic advantage. And this is why traditional concepts like escalation become more complicated in cyberspace. In physical conflict, escalation is usually visible and sequential. In cyber conflict, escalation can be invisible, distributed, and even reversible without clear signaling. That ambiguity makes it harder for states to define when a threshold has been crossed, and therefore harder to determine what an appropriate response should be. So cyber warfare exists in a strange space between peace and conflict. It is not always recognized as war in the traditional sense, but it is also not benign. It is a continuous condition of strategic interaction where probing, testing, and occasional disruption are part of the normal operating environment between states, and that leads to a deeper philosophical shift in how we think about security. In the past, security was often understood as a state of relative stability. You were either at war or you were not. In the cyber domain, that binary breaks down. Instead, you have a spectrum of activity where systems are constantly being tested, probed, and occasionally disrupted, even in the absence of open conflict. This means that modern societies are increasingly living inside what we might call a background layer of conflict. So most of the time, it is not visible. Most of the time, it does not escalate into something larger. But it is always present, shaping the way systems are designed, defended, and monitored. And perhaps the most important implication of all is this: cyber warfare shifts the center of gravity in conflict away from physical territory and toward information systems. That means the most important strategic assets are no longer just land, resources, or military bases. They are data flows, network integrity, and system resilience. So when we talk about cyber warfare as a new battlefield, we are really talking about a new definition of vulnerability itself. one that is less about where you are in the world and more about how deeply you are connected to systems that can be influenced from anywhere else. And that brings us to a final reflection. In an interconnected digital world, the most important question is no longer where the battlefield is, but whether the systems that define your reality are stable, trusted, and truly under your control. And if cyber warfare is an invisible battlefield, then the next logical step is to ask, what does power actually mean when you no longer need physical presence to project it? So, because historically, power was tied to movement. Armies crossed borders, navies controlled sea lanes, air forces dominated skies. Influence required visibility. You had to be somewhere in order to change something. Cyber power breaks that relationship entirely. For the first time in history, influence can be projected remotely, instantly, and often without any visible trace of origin. That creates a very different kind of strategic environment, one where geography matters less than access and where proximity is replaced by connectivity. In practical terms, this means a state does not need to physically enter another country to affect its core systems. Financial networks can be disrupted, communication systems can be manipulated, critical infrastructure can be targeted, political environments can be influenced indirectly through information flows, and all of this can happen without traditional military deployment. But the deeper shift is not technological, it is psychological, because when power becomes invisible, perception becomes unstable. If you cannot see the source of an action, you begin to question not only what happened, but who is capable of making it happen. That uncertainty changes behavior at the highest levels of decision-making. Governments, institutions, and even private actors must now operate with the assumption that disruption could originate from anywhere at any time without warning. And that creates a new form of strategic pressure, constant anticipation without clear visibility. So in the past, deterrence relied heavily on demonstration. You showed your capabilities, you signaled your reach, and you built credibility through visible acts. In cyberspace, credibility is more difficult to establish in the same way because the most effective operations are often the least visible. Success is not always measured by what is seen, but by what quietly fails to function when needed. This creates a paradox. The more effective cyber capabilities become, the less observable they are. And the less observable they are, the harder it becomes to fully understand the balance of power between actors. So instead of visible dominance, we now have what we might call distributed uncertainty. Power exists, but it is not always clearly attributable and not always clearly measurable in real time. That shifts the entire logic of international competition. It also changes how states think about sovereignty. Traditionally, sovereignty meant control over what happens within your borders. But in a digitally connected world, internal systems are often deeply integrated with external infrastructure, cloud services, global financial systems, international communication platforms. That means the boundary between inside and outside becomes blurred. So sovereignty is no longer just about territorial control. It is about system integrity. It is about whether a state can maintain control over its critical digital infrastructure, even when external actors are attempting to influence it remotely. And this is where cyber power becomes strategically transformative, because it allows states, or in some cases non-state actors, to exert influence without crossing physical borders. That changes the cost structure of intervention. Traditional military operations are expensive, visible, and often politically constrained. Cyber operations can be relatively low-cost, scalable, and difficult to attribute with certainty. That does not mean they are risk-free, far from it, but the risk calculus is different. It is less about immediate physical escalation and more about longer-term strategic friction. And this leads to an important behavioral consequence. Cyber capabilities lower the threshold for engagement. Actions that would be unthinkable in a physical military context can become thinkable in a digital one because the immediate costs appear lower and the attribution is less certain. But once that threshold is lowered, the system becomes more active overall, not necessarily more violent in a traditional sense, but more continuously contested. Instead of clear moments of conflict and peace, you get overlapping layers of activity, probing, testing, intrusion, defense, and adaptation, all happening simultaneously. This creates a condition that is very different from traditional deterrence environments. In nuclear or conventional military logic, stability often comes from clarity. Everyone understands the consequences of escalation. In cyberspace, clarity is harder to achieve, which means stability becomes more fragile and more dependent on constant adaptation. There is also a deeper philosophical implication here. If power can be exercised without presence, then influence no longer requires physical occupation or visible control. It can exist through systems, platforms, and networks that operate continuously in the background of global life. That means influence becomes embedded rather than imposed. And when influence becomes embedded, it also becomes harder to identify, isolate, or remove. It is no longer a question of who is occupying what, but who is shaping the conditions under which decisions are made. From that perspective, cyber power is not just about disruption. It is about shaping the environment of decision-making itself. It influences what information is available, how quickly systems respond, and how confident actors are in their own assessments. So, we are moving into a world where power is increasingly defined by the ability to shape uncertainty at a distance. Not by eliminating it, but by distributing it in ways that influence behavior. And that leads to a final reflection. In an age where influence no longer requires physical presence, the most important form of power is not visibility or force, but the ability to shape outcomes silently, continuously, and from a distance that may never be fully traceable. If cyber warfare changes how power is projected and experienced, then one of its most strategically important features is something far more subtle, but arguably even more consequential: the problem of attribution. In traditional conflict, attribution is usually straightforward. If missiles are launched, if troops cross borders, if ships are deployed, you can usually identify who is responsible within a relatively short period of time. Even in asymmetric warfare, responsibility tends to emerge through physical evidence, intelligence gathering, or political confirmation. There is a visible chain between action and actor. Cyber warfare breaks that chain. In the digital domain, actions can be routed through multiple countries, disguised through layers of infrastructure, or conducted through compromised systems that make origin extremely difficult to determine with certainty. What appears to be one actor may in fact be another. What looks like a state-level operation may be a proxy group. What seems coordinated may be fragmented, and what seems accidental may in fact be deliberate. This creates what we can call the attribution problem, but that phrase understates its strategic importance, and because this is not just a technical challenge for cybersecurity experts. It is a structural shift in how decisions about conflict and response are made at the highest levels of international politics. In traditional deterrent systems, attribution is the starting point of accountability, so once you know who is responsible, you can calibrate your response. You can escalate, de-escalate, or negotiate based on clarity, but when attribution is uncertain, that entire decision-making process becomes delayed, contested, and politically constrained. And in geopolitics, delay is never neutral. Delay is itself a strategic condition, because uncertainty about responsibility does not just slow down responses, it complicates them. And it forces governments to consider multiple scenarios simultaneously. What if we are wrong? What if we respond too strongly? What if we respond too weakly? What if the real actor is someone else entirely? So instead of a linear sequence, attack, attribution, response, you get a fragmented decision space where every option carries a higher level of risk than in conventional conflict. And that is where the strategic advantage emerges. Because in cyber conflict, uncertainty about attribution becomes a form of leverage. It does not guarantee immunity, but it raises the threshold for retaliation. It introduces hesitation into systems that are otherwise designed for decisive response. And in international politics, hesitation itself can be strategically significant. Now, it is important not to misunderstand this dynamic. Attribution is not impossible. In many cases, it is eventually achieved through intelligence, forensic analysis, and pattern recognition. But what matters is not just whether attribution happens, it is how quickly and how confidently it happens. Because speed and confidence determine the type of response that follows. If attribution is fast and certain responses can be direct and proportional, if attribution is slow or contested, responses tend to become more cautious, more indirect, or more politically filtered. That difference shapes the entire escalation ladder in modern conflict. This is why cyber operations are often designed not only to achieve a technical effect, but also to create ambiguity around responsibility. The objective is not just impact, it is uncertainty about origin. And that uncertainty has psychological consequences. It forces decision makers into a permanent state of interpretive judgment. They are no longer just reacting to what happened. They are evaluating competing narratives about who might have caused it, why it was done, and what it signals about future behavior. That interpretive burden changes the tempo of international response. It slows down the natural escalation logic that often exists in more visible forms of conflict. But there is also a deeper philosophical shift here. Attribution is not just about identifying the actor. It is about constructing meaning. It is about deciding what kind of event something is. Is it an act of war? Is it espionage? Is it sabotage? Is it criminal activity? Or is it something that does not fit neatly into any existing category? And those classifications matter because they determine what kinds of responses are considered legitimate or proportionate. So in cyber warfare, classification becomes as important as action itself. The way an event is defined shapes the space of possible reactions. And because attribution is often uncertain, classification itself becomes contested. This creates a kind of strategic gray zone where actions exist before they are fully named and where responses are delayed, not just by technical uncertainty, but by political and conceptual ambiguity. From a strategic perspective, this is highly significant because it means that cyber operations can create effects in the system before the system has fully decided what those effects are. Action precedes interpretation. Impact precedes classification. And that inversion of sequence creates a new kind of strategic environment. In that environment, the advantage often goes to the actor who can operate most effectively within ambiguity, not by eliminating attribution entirely, but by delaying it long enough to shape the initial response conditions. But this also introduces instability, because when attribution is uncertain, trust between states erodes more easily. Every incident becomes a potential signal of something larger. Every disruption becomes a potential precursor to escalation. And that increases the overall level of strategic suspicion in the system. So instead of clear deterrence, you get what might be called conditional deterrence, where responses depend not only on what happened, but on how confidently responsibility can be assigned. And that conditionality makes the system more fragile because it introduces variability into what should ideally be predictable response patterns. So when we step back, the attribution problem is not just a technical issue in cybersecurity, but it is a fundamental transformation in how responsibility, accountability, and response are structured in modern conflict. And it slows down escalation when clarity is absent, but it also increases uncertainty at every stage of decision making. And that combination reshapes the entire logic of deterrence in the digital age. And that leads us to a final reflection. In a world where actions can be separated from responsibility, the most powerful form of influence is not only the ability to act, but the ability to ensure that for a critical moment in time, no one is entirely sure who acted at all. If attribution is uncertain and power is increasingly invisible, then the final transformation brought about by cyber warfare is perhaps the most unsettling of all: the normalization of constant low-level conflict that exists below the threshold of traditional war. This is not the kind of conflict that begins with a declaration or ends with a treaty. It is not defined by clear phases of escalation and resolution. Instead, it is continuous, adaptive, and often imperceptible in real time. It exists in the background of modern state behavior, always active at some level, even when no one is formally at war. And that changes the meaning of peace itself. In traditional international relations, peace and war are treated as distinct conditions. You are either in one or the other. There may be tensions, crises, or standoffs, but there is still an underlying assumption that conflict is episodic. It starts at peaks and it ends. Cyber warfare disrupts that assumption. Because in the digital domain, probing, intrusion, surveillance, and disruption can occur continuously without triggering open escalation. Systems are tested not once, but repeatedly. Networks are scanned, vulnerabilities are explored, and defenses are adapted in real time. And all of this can happen without public acknowledgement or formal response. So what emerges is a condition where conflict is no longer an event. It is an environment. And in that environment, states must operate under the assumption that they are constantly being observed, tested, or challenged at some level. That does not mean constant crisis, but it does mean constant exposure. This creates a new kind of strategic mindset: persistent vigilance without clear closure. Governments, institutions, and critical infrastructure systems cannot assume a stable off state. Instead, they must assume that the background level of strategic interaction is always present, even when it is not visible. And that has psychological consequences, because humans and political systems are not naturally optimized for continuous ambiguity. We tend to think in terms of resolution. We look for signals that a situation has ended or stabilized. But in cyber conflict, resolution is often temporary, partial, or unclear. A system may be secured today and compromised tomorrow without any visible transition point. So instead of closure, you get adaptation. Instead of victory or defeat, you get cycles of exposure and repair. And instead of peace, you get managed tension. This is what makes cyber warfare so fundamentally different from traditional military conflict. It is not about winning a decisive battle. It is about maintaining resilience in a system where pressure never fully disappears. And that leads to a second important implication: the line between peace and conflict becomes increasingly blurred. In this gray zone, actions that would previously have been considered acts of war may now be interpreted as routine background activity. Conversely, routine activity can sometimes escalate into significant disruption without immediate recognition. That ambiguity creates a strategic environment where thresholds are harder to define and harder to enforce. And when thresholds become unclear, deterrence becomes more complex. In traditional deterrence models, stability is built on clear boundaries. If you cross this line, a response will follow. But in a world of continuous cyber activity, those lines become less visible. Like Instead of discrete boundaries, you have gradients of intensity. Instead of clear triggers, you have accumulated effects. This means that states must constantly interpret not just individual events, but patterns of behavior over time. Is this intrusion an isolated incident or part of a broader campaign? Is this disruption accidental or probing for future exploitation? Is this activity defensive, offensive, or something in between? Those questions do not have immediate answers, and that lack of immediate clarity is itself part of the strategic environment. So, what we are really seeing is the emergence of what we might call a permanent competition space. Not full-scale war, but not true peace either. A condition where strategic actors are continuously engaged at a low level, even when they are not openly confronting each other. And this has a profound effect on how states allocate resources and design their security systems. Cyber defense is no longer a temporary measure or a specialized function. It becomes a permanent layer of national infrastructure, something that must be maintained continuously, like electricity or water systems. But there is also a broader philosophical shift here. In a world of constant low-level conflict, security is no longer defined by the absence of attack. It is defined by the ability to absorb, adapt, and recover without systemic collapse. That changes the meaning of resilience. Resilience is no longer about preventing disruption entirely. That becomes impossible. It is about ensuring that disruption does not cascade into systemic failure. And that is a very different way of thinking about power, because it shifts focus away from absolute control and toward continuous adaptability under pressure. In that sense, cyber warfare does not just change how wars are fought, it changes how stability is maintained. It creates a world where instability is not an exception, but a background condition that must be actively managed. So, when we step back, the most important insight is this: cyber conflict does not eliminate peace, but it fundamentally redefines it. Peace becomes less about the absence of conflict and more about the management of continuous, low-level pressure across interconnected systems. And that leads us to a final reflection. In a world where conflict no longer begins or ends in clear moments, the real measure of security is not whether you are untouched by disruption, but whether you can remain functional, stable, and coherent in a reality where disruption is always already present in the background.